I have done 30 plus certifications and am here to guide you throughout your certification journey. In this video, we will be covering some important questions of the Microsoft AZ-204 exam. You can find the complete PDF of this video and our practice questions through the link down in the description. To the important questions, question 1. You have two Hyper-V hosts named host 1 and host 2. Host 1 has an Azure virtual machine named VM1 that was deployed by using a custom Azure Resource Manager template. You need to move VM1 to host 2. What should you do? Here in this question, we need to move VM1 to host 2. As such, we should, from the redeploy blade, click redeploy. Thus, the correct option is C. When you redeploy a virtual machine, it moves the virtual machine to a new node within the Azure infrastructure and then powers it back on, retaining all your configuration options and associated resources. Question 2. Your company has a web page named Web App 1. You use the Web Jobs SDK to design a triggered app service background task that automatically invokes a function in the code every time new data is received in a queue. You are preparing to configure the service processes a queue data item. Which of the following is the service you should use? Here in this question, based on the given scenario, the service that we should use is web jobs. Thus, the correct option is B. Usually, you shall host a web jobs SDK in Azure Web Jobs, but you can also run your jobs in a worker role. The Azure Web Jobs feature of Azure Web Apps provides an easy way for you to run programs such as services or background tasks in a web app. Question 3. You are developing an e-commerce web app. You want to use Azure Key Vault to ensure that sign-ins to the e-commerce web app are secured by using Azure App Service Authentication and Azure AD. What should you do on the e-commerce web app? Here in this question, we need to ensure that sign-ins to the e-commerce web app are secure by using the Azure App Service Authentication and Azure AD. As such, we should enable Managed Service Identity. Thus, the correct option is C. Managed Identity from Azure AD allows your app to easily access other Azure Active Directory protected resources such as Azure Key Vault. Question 4. You are creating an Azure Key Vault using PowerShell. Objects deleted from the Key Vault must be kept for a set period of 90 days. Which two of the following parameters must be used in conjunction to meet the requirement? Here in this question, to meet this requirement, the two parameters that must be used in conjunction are enable purge protection and enable soft delete. Thus, the correct options are B and D. To meet the requirement of keeping objects deleted from the key vault for 90 days, you need to use the enable purge protection and enable soft delete parameters when creating the key vault using PowerShell. Enable purge protection prevents the key vault from being permanently deleted before the soft delete retention period has elapsed. Enable soft delete allows deleted vault and its contents to be retained and recoverable for the specified number of days. Question 5. You manage an Azure SQL database that allows for Azure AD authentication. You need to make sure that database developers can connect to the SQL database via Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. You also need to make sure the developers use their on premises Active Directory account for authentication. Your strategy should allow for authentication prompts to be kept to a minimum. Which of the following should you implement? Here in this question, we need to make sure the developers use their on-premises Active Directory account for authentication. Our strategy should allow for authentication prompts to be kept to a minimum. As such, we should implement Active Directory integrated authentication. Thus, the correct option is C. Azure AD can be the initial Azure AD managed domain. Azure AD can also be an on-premises Active Directory domain services that is federated with the Azure AD. Question 6. You develop a web app on a tier D1 app service plan. You notice that page load times increase during periods of peak traffic. You want to implement automatic scaling when CPU load is above 80%. Your solution must minimize costs. What should you do first? Here in this question, we want to implement automatic scaling when CPU load is above 80% while minimizing costs. As such, we should switch to the standard app service tier plan. Thus, the correct option is C. Configure the web app to the standard app service tier. The standard tier supports auto scaling and we should minimize the cost. We can then enable auto scaling on the web app and add a scale rule and add a scale condition. Question 7. You are developing a .NET Core MVC application that allows customers to research independent holiday accommodation providers. You want to implement Azure Search to allow the application to search the index by using various criteria to locate documents related to accommodation. You want the application to allow customers to search the index by using regular expressions. What should you do? Here in this question, based on the given requirements, we should configure the query type property of the search parameters class. Thus, the correct option is B. The search parameters.query type property gets or sets a value that specifies the syntax of the search query. The default is simple. Use full if your query uses the Lucene query syntax. You can write queries against Azure Search based on the rich Lucene query parser syntax for specialized query forms. Wildcard, fuzzy search, proximity search, regular expressions are a few examples. Question 8. You are a developer at your company. You need to update the definitions for an existing logic app. What should you use? Here in this question, we need to update the definitions for an existing logic app. As such, we should use the logic app code view. Thus, the correct option is B. Question 9. You are a developer at your company. You need to edit the workflows for an existing logic app. What should you use? Here in this question, we need to edit the workflows for an existing logic app. As such, we should use the Logic Apps Designer. Thus, the correct option is D. The Logic Apps Designer. To edit the workflows for an existing logic app, you should use the Logic App Designer. The Logic App Designer is a visual interface that you can use to create, operate, and manage Logic apps. The designer allows you to define the triggers, actions, and conditions that make up the Logic app's workflow. You can use the designer to add, remove, or modify the connectors, expressions, and actions that make up the Logic app. Question 10. You are developing an application that uses Azure Blob Storage. The application must read the transaction logs of all the changes that occur to the blobs and the blob metadata in the storage account for auditing purposes. The changes must be in order in which they occur, include only create, delete, and copy operations, and be retained for compliance reasons. You need to process the transaction logs asynchronously. What should you do? Here in this question, based on the given scenario and requirements, we should enable the change feed on the storage account and process all changes for available events. Thus, the correct option is B. Change feed support in Azure Blob Storage. The purpose of the change feed is to provide transaction logs of all the changes that occur to the blobs and the blob metadata in your storage account. The change feed provides ordered, guaranteed, durable, immutable, read-only log of these changes. Client applications can read those logs at any time, either in streaming or in batch mode. The change feed enables you to build efficient and scalable solutions that process change events that occur in your blob storage account at a low cost. Question 11. You are developing an Azure Function app that processes images that are uploaded to an Azure Blob container. Images must be processed as quickly as possible after they are uploaded, and the solution must minimize latency. You create code to process images when the function app is triggered. You need to configure the function app. What should you do? Here in this question, based on the given scenario, in order to configure the function app, we should use a consumption plan, configure the function app to use an Azure Blob Storage input trigger. Thus, the correct option is E. Use an app service plan. Configure the function app to use an Azure Blob Storage trigger. Consumption plan can cause a 10-minute delay in processing new blobs if a function app has gone idle. To avoid this latency, you can switch to an app service plan with always on enabled. Question 12. You are developing a web application that runs as an Azure web app. The web application stores data in Azure SQL database and stores files in an Azure storage account. The web application makes HTTP requests to external services as part of normal operations. The web application is instrumented with application insights. The external services are Open Telemetry compliant. You need to ensure that the customer ID of the signed in user is associated with all operations throughout the overall system. What should you do? Here in this question, we need to ensure that the customer ID of the signed in user is associated with all operations throughout the overall system. As such, we should, on the current span context, set the trace ID to the customer ID for the signed in user. Thus, the correct option is B. Open telemetry uses correlation context and it fits the requirements. Correlation context carries user defined properties. These properties are typical data that you would like to eventually aggregate for correlation analysis or use to filter your trace data, such as a custom identifier. Question 13. You are developing an Azure durable function to manage an online ordering process. The process must call an external API to gather product discount information. you need to implement the Azure durable function. Which Azure durable function types should you use? Here in this question, we need to implement the Azure durable function. As such, the Azure durable function type that we should use are orchestrator and entity. Thus, the correct options are A and B. The durable functions extension exposes a set of built-in HTTP APIs that can be used to perform management tasks on orchestrations, entities, and task hubs. These HTTP APIs are extensively webhooks that are authorized by the Azure Functions host but handled directly by the Durable Functions extension. Question 14. To develop Azure Durable Functions to manage vehicle loans. The loan process includes multiple actions that must be run in a specified order. One of the actions includes a customer credit check process, which may require multiple days to process. You need to implement Azure Durable Functions for the loan process. Which Azure Durable Function types should you use? Here in this question, we need to implement Azure Durable Functions for the loan process. As such, based on the scenario, we should use the orchestrator type. Thus, the correct option is A. An orchestrator function is the appropriate type of Azure durable function to use in this scenario because it allows you to define the overall flow of the loan process and call other functions or activities as needed. The credit check process can be implemented as a separate activity function which can be called by the orchestrator function and run in parallel with directions in the loan process. Entity functions are designed for use cases where you need to perform operations on a shared piece of state in a reliable and atomic way, such as a distributed queue or counter. In this scenario, it does not appear that there is a need to use entity functions. There is no such thing as a client function in Azure durable functions. Activity functions are called by orchestrator functions to perform specific tasks, but the orchestrator function is the only one that defines the overall flow of the loan process. So it is the correct answer in this case. Question 15. You are developing several microservices to run on Azure Container Apps. External HTTP ingress traffic has been enabled for the microservices. The microservices must be deployed to the same virtual network and write logs to the same log analytics workspace. You need to deploy the microservices. What should you do? Here in this question, the microservices must be deployed to the same virtual network and write logs to the same log analytics workspace. We need to deploy the microservices. As such, we should use a single environment for all containers. Thus, the correct option is D. Question 16. You are building a website that uses Azure Blob Storage for data storage. You configure Azure Blob Storage Lifecycle to move all blobs to the archive tier after 30 days. Customers have requested a service level agreement for viewing data older than 30 days. You need to document the minimum SLA for data recovery. Which SLA should you use? Here in this question, we need to document the minimum SLA for data recovery. As such, the SLA that we should use is between 1 and 15 hours. Thus, the correct option is B. The archive access tier has the lowest storage costs, but it has higher data retrieval costs compared to the hot and cool tiers. Data in the archive tier can take several hours to retrieve depending on the priority of the rehydration. For small objects, a High priority rehydrate may retrieve the object from archive in under 1 hour. Question 7. You develop Azure solutions. A .NET application needs to receive a message each time an Azure virtual machine finishes processing data. The messages must not persist after being processed by the receiving application. You need to implement the .NET object that will receive the messages. Which object should you use? Here in this question, we need to implement the .NET object that will receive the messages. Also, the messages must not persist after being processed by the receiving application. As such, the object that we should use is QClient. Thus, the correct option is A. Question 18. You develop Azure solutions. You must connect to a NoSQL globally distributed database by using the .NET API. You need to create an object to configure and execute requests in the database. Which code segment should you use? Here in this question, we need to create an object to configure and execute requests in the database. As such, the code segment that we should use is new Cosmos client bracket on endpoint URI, comma, primary key bracket of semicolon. Thus, the correct option is C. For example, create a new instance of the Cosmos client. This.cosmos client equals new Cosmos client bracket on endpoint URI, comma, primary key bracket off. Then add this part to your code. Await this dot create database async brackets semicolon. Question 19. You have an existing Azure storage account that stores large volumes of data across multiple containers. You need to copy all data from the existing storage account to a new storage account. The copy process must meet the following requirements: automate data movement, minimize user input required to perform the operation, ensure that the data movement process is recoverable. What should you use? Here in this question, we need to copy all data from the existing storage account to a new storage account while meeting the given requirements. As such, we should use AZ copy. Thus, the correct option is A. You can copy blobs, directories, and containers between storage accounts by using the AZ copy v10 command line utility. The copy operation is synchronous, so when the command returns, that indicates that all files have been copied. Question 20. You develop and deploy a web application to Azure App Service. The application accesses data stored in an Azure storage account. The account contains several containers with several blobs with large amounts of data. You deploy all Azure resources to a single region. You need to move the Azure storage account to the new region. You must copy all data to the new region. What should you do first? Here in this question, we need to move the Azure storage account to the new region. Also, we must copy all data to the new region. As such, we should first export the Azure storage account Azure Resource Manager template. Thus, the correct option is A. To move a storage account, create a copy of your storage account in another region. Then move your data to that account by using AZ copy or another tool of your choice, and finally, delete the resources in the source region. To get started, export and then modify a resource manager template. Question 21. An organization deploys Azure Cosmos DB. You need to ensure that the index is updated as items are created, updated, or deleted. What should you do? Here in this question, we need to ensure that the index is updated as items are created, updated, or deleted. As such, we should set the indexing mode to consistent. Thus, the correct option is D. Azure Cosmos DB supports two indexing modes. Consistent, the index is updated synchronously as you create or delete them. This means that the consistency of your read queries will be the consistency configured for the account. None. Indexing is disabled on the container. Version 22. You are developing an application to store business critical data in Azure Blob Storage. The application must meet the following requirements. Data must not be modified or deleted for a user specified interval. Data must not be protected from overwrites and deletes. Data must be written once and allowed to be read many times. You need to protect the data in the Azure Blob Storage account. Which two actions should you perform? Here in this question, we need to protect the data in the Azure Blob Storage account while meeting the following requirements. As such, the two actions that we should perform are configure a time-based retention policy for the storage account and enable version level immutability support for the storage account. Thus, the correct options are A and D. About the options, time-based retention policy stores blob data in a write once read memory format for a specified interval. When time-based retention policy is set, clients can create and read blobs but cannot modify or delete them. After the retention interval has expired, blobs can be deleted but not overwritten. About option D, before you can apply a time-based retention policy to a blob version, you must enable support for version level immutability. Question 23. You create and publish a new Azure App Service web app. User authentication and authorization must use Azure AD. You need to configure authentication and authorization. What should you do first? Here in this question, we need to configure authentication and authorization. As such, we should first add an identity provider. Thus, the correct option is A. Question 24. You are developing a Java application that uses Cassandra to store key and value data. You plan to use a new Azure Cosmos DB resource and the Cassandra API in the application. You create an Azure AD group named Cosmos DB Creators to enable provisioning of Azure Cosmos account, databases, and containers. The Azure AD group must not be able to access the keys that are required to access the data. You need to restrict access to the Azure AD group. Which role-based access control should you use? Here in this question, we need to restrict access to the Azure AD group. As such, the role-based access control that we should use is Cosmos DB operator. Thus, the correct option is C. Azure Cosmos DB now provides a new RBAC role, Cosmos DB operator. This new role lets you provision Azure Cosmos accounts, databases, and containers, but cannot access the keys that are required to access the data. This role is intended for use in scenarios where the ability to grant access to Azure AD service principals to manage deployment operations for Cosmos DB is needed, including the account, database, and containers. Question 25. You provide an Azure API management managed web service to clients. The backend web service implements HTTP strict transport security. Every request to the backend service must include a valid HTTP authorization header. You need to configure the Azure API management instance with an authentication policy. Which two policies can you use? Here in this question, we need to configure the Azure API management instance with an authentication policy. Based on the given question, the two policies that we can use are basic authentication and certificate authentication. Thus, the correct options are A and C. Question 26. Your company is developing an Azure API hosted in Azure. You need to implement authentication for the Azure API to access other Azure resources. You have the following requirements. All API calls must be authenticated. Callers to the API must not send credentials to the API. Which authentication mechanism should you use? Here in this question, we need to implement authentication for the Azure API to access other Azure resources while meeting the given requirements. As such, the authentication mechanism that we should use is managed identity. Thus, the correct option is C. Azure AD Managed Service Identity gives your code an automatically managed identity for authenticating to Azure services so that you can keep credentials out of your code. Note, use the Authentication Managed Identity policy to authenticate with a backend service using the managed identity. This policy essentially uses the managed identity to obtain all access token from Azure AD for accessing the specified resource. After successfully obtaining the token, the policy will set the value of the token in the authorization header using the bearer scheme. Question 27. Question 27. You develop an app that allows users to upload photos and videos to Azure Storage. The app uses a storage REST API call to upload the media to a Blob storage account named Account 1. You have a blob storage containers named Container 1 and Container 2. Uploading of videos occurs on an irregular basis. You need to copy specific blobs from Container 1 to Container 2 when a new video is uploaded. What should you do? Here in this question, we need to copy specific blobs from Container 1 to Container 2 when a new video is uploaded. As such, we should create an event grid topic that uses the Start Azure Storage Blob Copy CMD. Thus, the correct option is B. Question 28. You are developing an ASP.NET Core website that uses Azure Front Door. The website is used to build custom weather data sets for researchers. Datasets are downloaded by users as CSV files. The data is refreshed every 10 hours. Specific files must be purged from the front door cache based upon response header values. You need to purge individual assets from the front door cache. Which type of cache purge should you use? Here in this question, specific files must be purged from the front door cache based upon response header values. we need to purge individual assets from the front door cache. As such, the type of cache purge that we should use is single path. Thus, the correct option is A. These formats are supported in the list of paths to purge. Single path purge. Purge individual assets by specifying the full path of the asset with the file extension, for example, slash square brackets 1. Wildcard purge. Strix may be used as a wildcard. Purge all folders, subfolders, and files under an endpoint with slash strix in the path, or purge all subfolders and files under a specific folder by specifying the folder followed by slash strix. For example, slash pictures slash strix. Root domain purge. Purge the root of the endpoint with slash in the path. Question 29. Your company is developing an Azure API. You need to implement authentication for the Azure API. You have the following requirements. All API calls must be secure. Callers to the API must not send credentials to the API. Which authentication mechanism should you use? Here in this question, we need to implement authentication for the Azure API while meeting the given requirements. As such, the authentication mechanism that we should use is client certificate. Thus, the correct option is D. If it is a caller outside Azure, it doesn't look like we can use managed identity in such a situation. I think the client certificate is better. Question 30. You are developing an Azure App Service REST API. The API must be called by an Azure App Service web app. The API must retrieve and update user profile information stored in Azure AD. You need to configure the API to make the updates. Which two tools should you use? Here in this question, we need to configure the API to make the updates. As such, based on the given requirements, the two tools that we should use are Microsoft Graph API and Microsoft Authentication Library. Thus, the correct options are A and B. The answer is Graph API and MSCL. API management has nothing to do with the developing of the REST API. These were all the questions for this video. You can find the complete PDF of this video and our practice questions through the link down in the description. We will be publishing more parts to this series in the future, so please make sure to subscribe our channel and press the bell icon. Thank you for watching and stay tuned.